I went outsourcing to find the people, places, and things that would allow me to kind of focus on my strong part, my strong suits, and get it done.
Podcast Junkies, episode 192. Another fun fact about this episode, it's falling on the week of the 5th year anniversary of Podcast Junkies. Yes, that's correct. April 9th, 2014, I launched my episode 1, episode 0, episode trailer, whatever I was calling it at the time, the first episode of Podcast Junkies where I introduced this show. And needless to say, I was incredibly nervous at the time. It was such a big deal for me. I was unknown in the podcasting community, and I was really anxious about what was going to happen when I released that episode. It's been such a crazy journey, and I feel like it's an important time to celebrate those little things. I'll be doing it again when I hit episode 200. Regular listeners will probably guess what can be expected on, or who can be expected on that episode. So stay tuned for that. But I thought I'd acknowledge the actual date, April 9th. It'll fall on the Tuesday in between episodes of this one and the following one. So it's just been an amazing, amazing journey. And I just want to say happy podcast birthday to me and to Podcast Junkies. And more importantly, to the 192 guests with a mix of other folks, probably who've been here a couple of times. So that's not a unique count, but I want to thank all of those folks and then all of the listeners who have joined me on this journey along the way. So just a special acknowledgement of that moment. Thank you for everything you do to support the show. I say that at the end, but this time I wanted to make that perfectly clear that it's such a special 5-year anniversary moment for me. And I think it is kind of cool. In case you missed last week's episode, it was one with Rich Jones of Paychecks and Balances. Rich is such a great stand-up guy. We had a fantastic conversation, and I just continue to say how much I love these opportunities to get to know these folks as friends a bit more, and also as people whose stories I want to share with you. And so that's a really great one. If you missed it, podcastjunkies.com/191 for Rich Jones. This week, I have another great guest, Lori Tharps. Lori actually had the tenacity to start her show based on a conversation we had at a conference where she approached me after I gave my talk, and she asked if she could be on the show and tell the story of her launching a podcast. Well, as you might imagine, there's a lot of folks who say they're going to launch a podcast, but then they don't. What's interesting about Lori's story is that she actually did. And she had me and my voice in her head because I told her, well, why don't you get your show started, get some episodes under your belt, and then come back and talk to me. And lo and behold, she did. And I'm true to my word. And I was so inspired by what she did and the concept of a show called My American Meltingpot. Naturally, we delve into a little bit of that story, that background when we start the episode. She likes to talk about the supportive nature of the podcast community, which I am in total agreement with, and regular listeners will know that. She talks about how she started her blog first, and then how she came to the format of My American Meltingpot, the show itself. We talk a little bit about how challenging it is to navigate sensitive and polarizing topics like race, and why it's important to do a lot of preparation and a lot of research. And her background in journalism helped her become a great podcast host. And that really shines through on her episodes. You can tell from the quality of the music, the way the show is paced, and her engagement with her guests. So those are all great signs of a great show, and she's off to a really great start. We talk about what the goals are for Lori's show and her secret wish to be a stand-up comedian. There's a lot of podcasters, I think, that have that secret wish. We learn about the knowledge she gained from listening to a whole bevy of different podcasts, and we go into a little bit about what we call the art of the interview and why she's an eternal student. She gives us the reason why she interviews guests in her studio, the relationship she's developed with her podcast producer, and a very intimate interview she conducted with a jazz musician. She also talks about My American Meltingpot in Spain and her upcoming trip there. So I'm really happy when people are motivated to do something very important to them, and in this case, start a podcast. And I'm especially honored to have it become as a result of the conversation she had with me after hearing me speak at a conference. I think it was Podcast Movement, if I'm not mistaken. But we dig into all of that. So without further ado, let's jump into that conversation. This episode is also brought to you by Focusrite. Focusrite, specifically the Scarlett 2i2, is my go-to piece of gear. It's something that I actually travel with now all the time. I'm recording on it now. I've got the Shure SM7B piped into the Focusrite. I love the portability of it. I love the clean sound, and it's the perfect complement to this microphone specifically. As most people know, the SM7B is pretty gain hungry, so I like having the flexibility of having the mic here and the monitoring that I can do and having the controls at hand, which is very handy when you have a guest that may be lower or higher than you. And I'm a big proponent of monitoring your own sound when you're recording. So all good things that the Focusrite allows. Hope to run into Dan at the upcoming NAB conference again. So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Lori. So Lori Tharps, host of My American Meltingpot, thank you so much for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you for having me.
So we always like to tell the origin story of how we connected. So you reminded me of it when we connected online. So if you want to take the listener to that, I think they'd appreciate it.
Okay, so last year at Podcast Movement, I was completely unaware of, really anything about the world of podcasting. I had made a goal for myself. I relaunched my blog, My American Meltingpot, in the beginning of 2018. And I had made a goal for myself that I was going to launch a podcast as well. And I thought, it was January when I was making these goals. And I was like, yeah, by summer, I'm going to have a podcast. And I really wasn't. I was late to the podcast game. I really wasn't one of those people who listened to a lot of podcasts. I listened to a couple, but what I did was I registered for Podcast Movement because I live in Philadelphia, so it wasn't a big deal to say that I was going to go. But I said, well, I'm going to register, and that way, I'll already be podcasting, and it'll just be so wonderful. So by the time May came around, and I was literally still dinkering around with the blog, hadn't gotten anywhere with investigating how to launch a podcast. I even thought about not going to Podcast Movement because I was like, I have nothing to say. I have nothing to do. Anyway, so it was in Philly. I'd already registered. I'd already paid. So I said, I'll go. So you were one of the first people I heard speak. And you had this amazing story about falling off a cliff and deciding what was really important in life. And I was like, this man is his story is giving me life. This is amazing. And I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, and I'm a storyteller, and I'm a people person. And I just was like, I have to meet him. And then, and then when you obviously explained what Podcast Junkies, no shade, I'd never heard of your podcast because I literally knew nothing about podcasting. Yeah. But I was like, wow, he does a podcast about podcasting. How fascinating. That's so smart. And then I thought, well, maybe he wants to do a show about someone who doesn't have a podcast, but wants to start one. And so I accosted you in line somewhere and tried to pitch you this idea. And you were so nice. But you were like, my show is really about people who have podcasts. So if you get a podcast, if you really launch, talk to me again. And believe it or not, your voice was in my head this whole time that I've been, trying to, get my podcast off the ground, because I was like, I want to be on Podcast Junkies. And Harry Duran said I could not do that unless I actually had a podcast. And I kind of looked at it as a challenge that I really was going to come back to you, because I didn't want you to think I was a total fool when I came up to you. And that, because I told you I was going to launch a podcast, and that's what I did. And I literally said, when I get, the first season done, I'm going to come back to Harry and say, hey, I did it. You said, so can I be on your show now?
Well, it's so interesting because, as you might imagine, when you go to a podcasting conference and you tell people you have a show that interviews podcasters, everyone is like, well, I'll be on your show. So you have to have some sort of filtering process, right? And in the beginning, when I started the show, I've talked about this a couple of times, I used to say, I want people who have had 50 episodes because I want people to be super serious and I want them to be committed. And, I've been doing this for several years. Regular listeners will now know that that flew out the window early on because it was more important for me to have interesting conversations with people who are passionate in some form or another about podcasting. And I've had people who don't have a show but actually have developed a service or are entrenched in the podcasting community. So it's now telling the story of everything that's happening around podcasting. And it's still 90%, 95% of folks obviously have a show, but some folks have started just recently as you. And I think it tells a more rounded picture when folks like you come on, and we're gonna dig into the details of what that journey's been like for you. But I think it's gonna be fascinating and inspiring as well for people who were where you were, because I think there's a stat with Podcast Movement has probably talked about this a lot. People who come to Podcast Movement or Podfest or one of these other great podcasting conferences, they get excited. They say they're going to start a podcast, and then a year later, you run into them at the podcasting conference again. You're like, "How's that show? Did you start it?" Like, "No, I didn't start it."
Yeah.
So I want you to talk about that a little bit, and you said the voice in your ear was mine, so that was a bit inspiring. So, but I think I would guess there's some aspect of your personality that's also when you say you're going to do something, I imagine you make a plan to do it.
I do. I am definitely one of those people. And I have to say, it's kind of funny because I literally just pitched a topic to speak at the next Podcast Movement addressing that very issue about getting so excited and then being so overwhelmed and not knowing where to start. So like I said, I came to Podcast Movement with a blog and a lot of bravado. I'm going to start a blog. I'm going to start a podcast. Of course I am.
How hard could it be?
But by day 2.5, I was like, okay, it's going to take me 2 years to start a podcast because I don't know how to edit audio. And I felt like the overriding message was your audio has to be good. Nobody wants to listen to bad audio. And so many of I didn't go to a lot of the technical sessions, but I went to enough to hear that, there were terms that I was like, what are they talking about? I don't even know what they're talking about. How am I going to make it so that I don't do those bad things, but I don't even know what those things are?
Yeah.
So by day 2, I was a little bit defeated because I thought, even though all these people in this room have podcasts and everybody's saying everybody can have a podcast, I was like, I don't know how to soundproof my closet. They're like, you just need one of these microphones. And one of these microphones was one of 20, and it just overwhelmed me. But the great thing was that I ran into somebody who had a podcast studio in Philadelphia, and they were like, we'll do everything for you. You just come and talk. You just come and bring your content. I'm a journalist. I'm a storyteller. I know how to tell a story. I know how to interview people. I know what a good story is. And I knew what I wanted to talk about. But the tech stuff was what got me. So as soon as once I realized that there were people who offered services that could take some of the tech out of my hands, it opened up the door. So by the time I left Podcast Movement, I had networked my butt off with everybody I knew who would do editing, who had a studio, in all different, variations of the same. I met people who were offering to edit from Miami, and I was like, how would we do that? But okay, tell me, how do you do that? Tell me about your service. So that's what my my takeaway from Podcast Movement was, I can do this. I don't have to spend, 2 years learning how to be a good audio editor. And it's not just the editing, but it's just capturing the sound. Just figuring out which, platform to use was also overwhelming to me. So again, I left Podcast Movement okay, I am going to start my podcast because I said I was going to, and I really want to, because I also had been very inspired by, again, the power of podcasting. Plus, I love the people. Podcasters are they're just kind of wonky, nerdy, into their thing. It's a cool group to be a part of. I wanted in, not from the peripheral, I listen to you guys. No, I was like, yeah, I'm one of you. so I left knowing that what I needed to do was to find a team, if you will, like to find people who I could outsource the things that I didn't know how to do, and then figure how that was going to work. And that's exactly what I did. I went outsourcing
Yeah.
to find the people, places, and things that would allow me to kind of focus on my strong part, my strong suits, and get it done.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about the community, because it's something that resonated with me when I went to the first podcast movement, which is now about 5 years. It's 5 years ago. It's 2014, right after I'd started my show. And what I realized is like, wow, this is my tribe. This is the stuff that we love to talk about. And it's when you go to a conference and you can all geek out on the same things, like all you do is talk about like downloads and microphones and websites and recording, and there's something for everyone there. And different from other conferences that I used to go to in my corporate world or in my corporate life, everyone is just so helpful. Everyone just really wants to help you and they want you to succeed. And I imagine that's a little bit of what you felt when even though this was your first podcasting conference, you probably picked up on that right away.
Yeah, I picked up on it so much that I didn't want it to end. And by the end of the podcast movement, we created a splinter Philly podcast movement group and started our own little group so we could keep meeting, because it was that much of this is amazing. And the thing about, I think the reason that podcast community can be so supportive is because we have this thing in common, which is podcasting, but our subject matter could be completely different. So that feeling of competitiveness is kind of eliminated, because, my podcast buddies are talking about one friend of mine, my new podcast friend, she's doing a podcast about philanthropy, and one is doing a podcast about living an alternative lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And again, as a journalist, the reason I'm a journalist is because I'm nosy and I like to talk. So podcasting is perfect for me, but this community of people who have this thing that they like to talk about so much that they decided to create a podcast about it just appeals to me, because these are people are really intensely passionate about both podcasting, but also their content, which just, it's endless conversations. And then there's a little bit of entrepreneurship that I enjoy about podcasting as well, because it's your own thing. You literally are owning this thing. And, the downloads and the marketing and the PR stuff. I mean, I kind of like that too, because, that's just, it's part of it. It really, really allows me to connect to all these different parts of my personality, and the community. You find more people like that. I mean, there are other people who are I love this, bird watching, but I also love to figure out how I can talk about bird watching with other people. And then I have this cool microphone, or I did this cool thing where I went to the library and I read this woman, literally, she has a bird watching podcast, and she
is it Susie Buttress?
I don't remember her name because we're friends online, but she was
it's a casual. No, I forgot the name of the show. She's good.
Because I don't know how many birdcasts per bird watching.
She's been on Susie Buttress has been on the show, and she's really a fan of the show as well.
Well, she was. If it was her, she was talking about how she kind of got on this roster of speakers at her local library of older adults. Okay. So they didn't even know what podcasting was. She had to introduce them to the concept, but they were really jazzed on the bird watching. So she totally cultivated a whole new audience from senior citizens. And it just the kind of stealthy way she did that, making them think they were going to get a lecture on bird watching, but really she got 20 new podcast listeners and subscribers who, it's just really cool. And I just love that. So, again, I'm not a bird watcher, but I just love the way she's approaching, developing an audience, and I might try, in fact, true confession, I totally am doing that. I'm already talking to my local library, and figuring out how to jump in on their audience about this topic that I can use to, introduce my podcast. So
that's so interesting, because especially this idea of the library is the one place that has every topic imaginable, right? And so if you can organize a talk they're always looking, because people think that libraries are like going out of fashion, but I think there'll always be a place for them, and they're always looking for content. They're always looking for ways to pull in people to come into the physical building. And I think if you have a topic you want to talk about, just pick the topic of your podcast, and then you can talk about that. And then at the end, you can, similar to what this woman did with her show, just say, and by the way, if you want, I talk about this every week on my show. And if you don't know what a podcast is, pull out your phone right now and I'll show you exactly how to subscribe, because, typically with an older demographic, you might need to hold their hand a little bit. But I always tell everyone I meet when it comes to podcasting, like, you need to get out of the podcasting circle as well and be where your listeners are. So whatever, for me, it's a bit meta because it's a podcast about podcasting. So,
right.
So I go to podcasting conferences, but if you're talking about bird watching, you go to a bird watching conference, right? And so if there's places where your topic resonates and people want to hear about it, then, you come in with the topic, but then when they ask you like who you are, the one thing that you can now say, and I tell people this all the time, is to make sure, like on Facebook and on LinkedIn, that you put host of My American Meltingpot. Like that's going to grab people's attention. You're like, wait, you're the host of a show as well, and it's a conversation starter.
Right. You know what? Thanks for reminding me. I think I need to go change my LinkedIn profile because I just had podcaster, but host sounds a lot more Thank you.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to write that down.
Yeah, you're the host of a show. Showrunner is another title people like to use a lot, and that comes from like the TV and film world as well.
Right. Yeah, I'm a host.
Yeah, you are.
Thank you.
So did you have, I know you said you had the blog already, so did you have that as a starting format for how you were going to structure your episodes?
Not really. The blog was I started the blog 12 years ago, and it basically was my outlet as a journalist to write about issues about race and pop culture that mainstream media outlets weren't very interested in, they weren't necessarily interested in the same stories that I was interested in. Mm-hmm. I worked at Entertainment Weekly magazine, I work for Glamour and Essence, and even Essence, like they have their editorial, calendar. They know what they want to talk about. And just as an example, I wanted to, before Ricky Martin became, the big thing in the 90s. Was that the 90s? Yeah. Like I was like, everybody in the world is listening to this guy, Ricky Martin. And at Entertainment Weekly, they were like, he's not important. And I was like, you're kidding me. I was just at Madison Square Garden and the place was packed. Yeah. And the amazing thing was it was packed with people of every ethnic group that you could imagine. Mm-hmm. There were Asian people there. There were Black people there. There were white people there. There were Latinos there. Everybody is jamming out to his music in Spanish. So like, this is an entertainment story. And, they were like, yeah, I don't think so. So that's when I was like, I've got to start a blog so that I can write about these things that I'm seeing and I'm noticing that the people in my world are talking about, even if quote unquote mainstream media isn't ready to talk about it yet. So when I decided to relaunch the blog in 2018, kind of I knew I wanted to do it in a more public facing way. I knew I wanted to be more than just my personal observations, my musings. Like I really wanted to have more of an impact in the kind of national conversation about race, diversity, and pop culture. So that's why I wanted to start a podcast as well, because I knew I could reach more people with the podcast and bring more voices into kind of the brand. So the format was really, for lack of a better word, it was pretty much based on, your average kind of NPR interview show. It was kind of based on Radio Times or Fresh Air, or Fresh Air, but with a little more me, a little more personality, and a tiny bit of humor. Because one of the things that I always stress when I talk about race and pop culture is like, I don't talk about race and pop culture to depress people. I'm not looking at doing another show that's going to, bring you down at the end of the show. You're depressed. I really want people to think about, our American popular culture from a multicultural perspective. So, for example, I did an episode on technology, but we talked about like how technology can actually be racist. Which people don't think about. I didn't even think about it until I talked to a friend who is a data journalist and had really kind of done a lot of research on this idea that because humans program our technology, and humans can be racist or biased, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and they can bake in their bias into technology, and that's something we should really be aware of. So I like to think of my show as conversations about diverse topics with diverse people that will make an audience think differently. And really that's all I'm trying to do. And I'm trying to do it in a way that's enlightening and entertaining. Like, I want people to be smiling, laughing, thinking, and sharing this information when they're done. So I always start with a melting pot minute, which is kind of my opportunity to do a little bit of riffing on some kind of current event, or thought piece, if you will. And then it's a conversation with my invited guest or guests on the topic at hand. Right now it's bi-weekly, and I did that to ease myself into the rhythm of podcasting. Eventually I would like to go to a weekly show, but I have read enough burnout stories, and I didn't want to put myself, I didn't want to set myself up to fail. So we come out every other Friday, and again, that was the idea, was to keep it kind of short enough for a evening commute, like a 30, 40-minute show. I have completely not been able to do that. The show is a little, some episodes a little longer because some of these topics are just so fascinating. I cannot cut, what would be needed. The first episode, I was like, we got to keep it under 40 minutes because, that's how long it takes for somebody to get home from work. But I personally love a longer conversation. I don't shut it off. I literally will sit even though it's in my ears and I can move, I still sit in my car as if I can't turn it off. So I recognize that I think if the conversation is going well, if the story is really interesting, not to cut it off, to let it go a little bit longer.
That reminds me, I always have a Facebook group for folks that are in the podcasting world. And I always try to ask a stimulating question or something around podcasting. I think the next one is going to be, when's the last time you sat in your driveway to finish a podcast episode? Because people do that all the time. What I thought was interesting is, especially with a topic as sensitive as the one you have, that you can have a choice of whether you want to be polarizing or not. And I think when you are, I'm Latino, and so sometimes these types of topics come up, and you have to figure out, do you want to be inclusive and actually have a conversation, or a friendly debate? So, I've had people on whose ideas I don't necessarily agree with on the show before. And in the beginning, I'd be a little worried, like, are they going to say something that I'm not going to agree with? And I'm just going to be like, oh no, should I confront them or should I not? And it's this idea of being, of disagreeing without being disagreeable and just not, just or agreeing to disagree in a way that you respect that that's their opinion. And you have to understand the context of where they were born and how they were raised. And maybe that colors a lot of how they view the world. And at the end of the day, realizing that we're not all going to be on the same page, it's not going to happen. And I think we just have to respect each other's opinion and just do it in a way where we're not fighting, but at least we're having the conversation, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
I agree 100%. I have to say, for my first season, my guests I'm lucky because I have been a journalist for over 20 years, and I have had the privilege of meeting and interacting with some really amazing people. So I was able to tap into my network for most of my guests. I think almost all of my guests for the first season were people that I had a connection to. But I know for season 2, I've got to branch out a little bit. And that is one of the things that I worry about, is, given the topics that I want to discuss, what happens when it's not a love fest, in terms of us agreeing on the issue at hand. And I pride myself on being that type of person who can have these difficult, quote unquote, race conversations in a way that is productive and not combative. And I'm already thinking, what do I do? Do I push, if I've invited someone on my show and they have an idea, or a thought that, goes against maybe what I believe, do I push them? Do I challenge them, or do I just let their opinion, rest and, we move on? That is something I'm, thinking about as the host of this show. It hasn't happened yet. Although there was one guest, I have to say, there was one guest who I knew she had a certain opinion about a certain politician that I really disagreed with. And I just prayed that it wouldn't come up. And because I was like, if she says something, I'm going to have to say something, but she didn't. So that disaster was averted. It wouldn't have been a disaster, but I really did have to think, like, what is my response going to be if that comes up? Which I think really just speaks to being prepared, right? Yeah. Like, you don't want to invite somebody on your show and not really know where they're coming from, what their thoughts are, what their beliefs are, because I think that would be, my show is not live, so we could always bleep something, edit something out, but I think it's really important. And again, I'm learning this as I go, that really knowing, like, doing the research on your guests is really important so that you can be prepared, or even say, like, ahead of time, we're going to, we're not going to go in this direction. Like, we're going to talk about this, this, and this. Let's keep, that aspect out of it, just so you don't even have to tell the person why you don't want to talk about that. But I have, from experience, understand, like, how to kind of avoid those confrontations, but also keeping in mind that I might not be able to avoid them all the time. But I don't ever want a guest to come on my show and feel that they came and were beat up or put on trial for their thinking. And that's not the kind of show I want to have anyway.
Can you talk a little bit about how your 20 years of journalism experience has helped you both prepare and actually have these types of conversations?
Yeah, so my career as a journalist actually began in entertainment journalism. I worked at Vibe magazine, and then I worked at Entertainment Weekly magazine. And I was, to, keep the Ricky Martin theme going, living La Vida Loca. Like, I was really, having a great time. But in the back of my mind, I always thought that, my role as a Black woman who grew up with a lot of privilege, that, my role was to make the world a better place somehow. Like, that always was supposed to be, I wasn't just supposed to be out here, cavorting with, movie stars. And I always felt a bit of guilt about that. So even though I was making money from entertainment journalism, I was always kind of working and writing about, I'd say, social issues, if you will. And I wrote, I've written four nonfiction books that all have to do with race and identity. And all of my books are really made for a general audience. Like, when I write about and talk about, like, race and identity as, a professional writer, I'm always really intentional about making my work really accessible. I don't want to shut people out of these very important conversations. My first book was called Hair Story, Untangling the Roots of Black Hair in America, which one might think, well, that must be a book for Black people since it's about Black hair. But since Black people live amongst everyone else and everyone sees their hair, it's like, it's a book that can be enjoyed. And the Hair Story as a book, yes, is appealing to Black people, but it's appealing to anybody who's ever wondered about the wonders of Black hair, whether it's about the styling or the history or the politics. And I literally, I co-wrote the book with a friend, and we really wrote that book with the intention of making Black hair not so mysterious and misunderstood in the world. And you cannot create content with the idea that it's only for one kind of person. If your goal is to make the world a better place, everybody's got to be informed by, everybody has to have the same information. And that's kind of the problem with our country, I think, about race a lot of the times, is that so many people are coming from everybody has a different rule book. Everybody got some different information. So when we come to the table, it's hard to have a conversation because you're like, wait, Texas is what, and, George Washington did what, because people have different sources of information or lack of information entirely. So again, my goal is, to make the world a better place, to eliminate racism altogether. And this idea that America has been a racist place since day one, that we are naturally self-segregating is not really true. If you understand that American history has been diverse since day one, that people of diverse backgrounds have been working together, living together, loving each other from day one, then the conversations we could be having today would be very, very different. So as a journalist, my goal has always been to like unearth these types of stories that showcase diversity in action. So whether that's, doing a profile of a Black Brazilian chef who is working in New York City, or, a story about Korean, Mexican food, there's obviously a food theme here, or, doing this story about Latinos and Indian people, Indian from India, like Pakistani community in the California, and that people don't know that this is all part of American history. So I've been researching and writing about these issues, articles, blog posts, books since 1999, really. And so the podcast has just, it's the same thing. And that's why, in the beginning, when I said, oh, I'm ready to start a podcast, but the technical stuff is going to slow me down. I don't want to be slowed down, but at the same time, because I have been doing this for a while, I do have a professional reputation. Like I have written, award-winning books and, written in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So I'm not going to put out a podcast that sounds like, an amateur hour, right? So for me, finding the guests, interviewing them, doing the research beforehand, got that, totally got that. Although I have to say, and my editor, who I have an amazing editor producer who comes from from NPR, from public radio. Nice. He helps me a lot because there's a lot of things you can do when you're doing an interview for print that you can't do in a microphone. Like people don't want to hear all of my blah, blah, blah stories and all my aha. My editor will, and he just is like, you did it again. I've got to edit out all of those ahas, like stop talking. Yeah. All of that. So, and of course there's a different way to conduct an interview, that you're just extracting information that then you're going to write down, as opposed to an interview for other people to enjoy the actual sound of the other person's voice. So, there is a definite learning curve, but I have to say, the approach in finding fascinating topics, the approach in finding my guests, the approach in researching the story is something that, again, comes from a long, background in doing just that for other mediums.
I like the fact that you created your trailer, your episode 0. So that's a great story. I'm a huge proponent of that. It's something we do when we produce shows for clients. And I think it's just a great way to encapsulate your story, and it pulls folks in who may have never heard of you or don't know what the show is going to be about. And you did it very well. And
thank you.
It was entertaining, and
thank you.
Injecting a little bit of humor in that as well. So.
Well, I secretly want to be a stand-up comedian. So phase 3 of my life, be from podcast to stand-up comedian. Yeah. My student, I'm a professor at Temple University, and my poor students, I'm like trying out my jokes with them too. I'll probably be a professor for life because I don't think I have what it takes to be a comedian, but give me a microphone.
Yeah, everyone has got folks have bucket list items, right? It's always like skydiving or like public speaking, but I know a lot of folks that have like a 5-minute comedy set, right? Because, and that's, I was at a comedy show last night before, and actually at the Comedy Store. I was in LA, and I'm in Minneapolis now. But it's crazy when you think about how challenging something like that is, and you take it for granted. You're like, how it's 5 minutes, like it's quick, and telling one joke on stage is hard enough. Stringing together like a theme and a story, and it's definitely an art form, and it's always fascinating to me because I'm the type of person that's situationally funny, and like I could crack a joke at a dinner table and have people laughing, but then I sometimes delude myself into thinking, well, I could go on stage and do this, and then I see the folks who do it, and I'm like, I just know. It's the nerves of how, like, having a joke not land, and then it's like crickets in the room.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Well, that's the same thing I felt about podcasting, though. Originally, and thank God I have this amazing producer. Hi, Brad. Just, thanks, Brad.
Shout out to Brad.
Shout out to Brad 100%, because again, coming from a, long journalism background, loving to talk to people, I really thought like I have what it takes to do interviews with the microphone for a podcast. And it's not that easy. That is definitely, a big learning curve, that doing a really good interview requires much more than, what I just assumed would be kind of a continuation of my kind of journalism background. And listening to so many, what I did when I left Podcast Movement was literally like just listen to podcasts nonstop. And I would listen. And if it was horrible, I'd stop listening. Like I didn't force myself to keep listening to bad podcasts, but I was taking notes of like, oh my God, she asks really dumb questions, or she doesn't do follow-up questions, or she keeps interrupting her guest, or you can tell that she's trying not to interrupt her guest so much so it sounds like she's not listening. Like there would be so many different ways that you could hear like how hard it actually is. And then like listening to people who do really good interviews, you almost don't notice it, right? You're saying, why do I enjoy this one? What makes this person's interview style so good? It's a combination of X, Y, Z. They don't interrupt. They ask good questions. They do the follow-up, all of these different things. And I spent a lot of times, and I'm still like, if I have a favorite podcast, I listen to it as a podcaster, not just as a consumer, because I'm literally trying to figure out, why is it that I can listen to this person's voice over and over and over again? To the point, there's even one podcast I listen to where I'm like, I love her laugh. Like, whereas there's another podcast where I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot stand her little like giggle or something like that. So even to that point, you have to ask, what makes the interview, this one better than that one? And, what are the skills that you really need to work on to make sure that, it becomes like consistent, like format and form.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially the art of the interview, because having done, I'm getting up on 200 right now, pretty soon. And I've just been fascinated and just become an eternal student of it. And so all those points that you had about, typically it's funny from an editing perspective. If you see because you typically see them as separate WAV files, and if you see the host with like a lot of like activity and the guest with like very little activity, you're like, you can tell right away. Someone put that in one of the editing groups on Facebook. They're like, what's the problem with this conversation? And all they did was post the two WAV files, and you're just like, host, guest. You're like,
yes.
So it's a fine line. But now, because it's interviews, I listen to other interviewers, and I'm always open for suggestions, and I listen to questions people ask, and I keep a list of, oh, I'm going to add that question, or I'm going to add a flavor of that question, like in my conversations. And I think that's always why I've loved doing video for this, and now we're using Squadcast, because there's something about even the body language or asking a question, and then when people think, the way they cock their head when they're thinking, they're just like, that's a good question. And if this was like just audio, I'd be like, Lori, you still there? Like,
right.
I'm nervous. And so just little things like that, I think. But then to your point, keeping in mind that at the end of the day, it's going to be consumed on audio, and it's going to probably 80 to 90% of podcasts are consumed on mobile. So people have their earbuds in. And so to your point, I tell this to folks all the time, like people are more discerning now with podcasts, and they don't have the patience for, the two guys or the two gals in a basement, or, doing their brunch podcast where they're, by the end of it, they're drunk. And
I just could not, I'm like, skip. No, not interesting at all. And I think it's true, because there are so many well-produced podcasts that it's like, you don't need to listen to that unless they're your best friends or something like that. But that's one thing that my producer, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have a studio, is because I did want to have my guests in the room with me, which again, it's true that no one's going to see the guest, although true. Like, again, projecting into the future, want to do some video of some of these interviews, but I know that our conversations, I've had about, I think like I'd say 50% of the guests that we've had have been in studio and 50% have been on the phone. And I have to say that the ones where they're in studio, it's just a better rapport. I feel like the conversation has gone better. And I bill my show as, that we have conversations, that I'm not interviewing people, that we're having a discussion. And so that obviously can happen a lot better when you can see the other person and you can like tell that, oh, that question made them uncomfortable. I had my Barbara Walters moment where I had someone, she actually cried. I was like, I wasn't happy she cried, but I was like, oh my God, I feel like Oprah right now.
No, it's so funny because, it sounds weird to say but you realized I think you realized you asked something or you're having a conversation that's resonating. And,
right.
Like when someone says, no one's ever asked me that before, every podcaster like wants to hear that. Like, oh, yes, yes,
Right.
yes.
Yeah,
And if you're having a real connection with people and they are getting emotional about it, then it sort of speaks to you're having a genuine connection, a human to human connection. And, you've had them feel so comfortable that they can do that in your presence, which is, really a testament to you. And I'm sure from your journalism background, but just empathizing with your guest as well is really important.
Yeah. And that's, again, like I said, I'm trying to have conversations with people. I want people listening to feel like they're part of a conversation. And so again, yes, we do our research. Obviously, I said we, it's me. Like, it's a one woman operation when we talk about research.
Does that, yeah.
Right. Like the team. But
well, Brad, right?
Brad is amazing. Brad does everything. He does the editing.
Yeah.
He does all of the engineering, everything. But it's me who does all the content. But, for that episode, we actually interviewed the woman who created our theme music. She's a jazz musician. And she, again, the melting pot theme is race and pop culture. She happens to be the daughter of a Black man who was a Black Panther in his day. And her mother is Japanese American and was actually in the internment camps. And so she had this very like radical upbringing and is now, like a world famous jazz musician. And because she lives in Philly and because Philly is like the small city and the big city, we got connected and she made our theme music. So we decided to interview her because, what better, example of pop culture and race than Sumi Tanoka? She's amazing. Yeah. But she had this her backstory, which when I asked her to do the theme music, it wasn't like I researched her backstory and her family heritage or anything like that. So in researching it, I was like, oh my gosh, because she had actually created an entire musical piece about the Japanese internment camps in honor of her mother. And getting into that conversation, it just became very personal. But because we were sitting right next to each other, right? And again, we weren't friends, like we didn't have a deep relationship, but being in the same room and having this conversation, and I think that's why podcasting feels very intimate, and what I hope to convey to the audience is that they're part of this intimate conversation, right? And that, I'm very proud of that episode because I'm not a musician. I don't know very much about jazz particularly, but we were still able to have this really powerful conversation because it was about, race, popular culture, art, and we were able to still have this deep, meaningful connection. And she played piano for us live in the studio. So it was just a really amazing, example of the power of podcasting, if you will.
Yeah. Are you attending Podcast Movement in Orlando in July?
Well, I literally just submitted a proposal to speak. And I kind of said that if I get selected to speak, that'll be my, look, I'll go. I'm actually going to be in Spain for a big part of the summer. I'm going to be doing the podcast. I'm going to be doing 3 special episodes from Spain for the podcast, which I'm really excited about. I wrote a book called Kinky Gazpacho, and it came out in 2009. And
Awesome title.
thank you. And it's about, it's a memoirs, but the last third of the book was about my discovery of African slaves in Spain, which makes a lot of sense because Spain kind of owned most of the slave ships. They weren't, So most people who were, trafficking in slaves were paying a tax to the Spanish. And my husband is from the south of Spain, and we were in the south of Spain, and I was like, wouldn't it make sense that some Black people got off the boats? Wouldn't it make sense that there were actually Black people in Spain in the 15th, 16th century? And I asked around, and people were like, no, we never had slaves here. There were no Black people here ever. And I was like, I'm finding that hard to believe. So I turned it into a magazine story. I pitched the story, and it was a great article, and then it turned into the book. So again, the last third of it is about, discovering Spain's kind of hidden Black history. So I'm going to do 3 episodes, the 10-year anniversary of Kinky Gazpacho, talking about what it's like to be Black in Spain in 2019. There's been there's been a couple of really cool documentaries that have come out about Black people's influence in flamenco music. And there's just been a lot of chatter within academia about really talking about not just the Black history of Spain, but also the Jewish and Moorish history of Spain, which is always kind of just glossed over.
Yeah.
So it's a total My American Meltingpot in Spain special episode. So I'm really excited about that. And I'll be in Spain almost all summer. So I would literally be coming back from Spain and hopping on a plane and going to Orlando, which doesn't sound horrible. It sounds really awesome, but I have 3 kids, one of whom is going to college starting in August. So like I said, if I get chosen to speak, I'll be well, somebody really wants me to go to Podcast Movement. I would love to go in a heartbeat, but it might be biting off too much for this particular summer. I also think it's crazy that anybody is trying to have a conference in Orlando in August. Yeah. What? Yeah. And it's funny because every conference, the National Association of Black Journalists conference is in Miami in August. And I'm who is thinking about doing these things? It's the Associated, it was a writing conference in Boston in February. It was half people couldn't go because it's, they got snowed out. I'm
well, I don't know. I think for the conferences in Orlando, most of the time we'll be indoors anyway, and it'll be the AC. You'll actually be probably cold because the AC will be blasting, and everyone will have sweaters on.
Right.
That's typically what happens. But regular listeners will know that we like to put intentions out into the universe. So if Dan or Jared are listening from Podcast Movement, they'll give your application a closer look and accept you.
I hope so, because a bunch of us at the end. No joke, Podcast Movement changed my life. I want to be there if for no other reason, because I want to see everybody that I met last year. But a bunch of us took pictures on stage. So that if we did, make it next year, make it this year, and we got to speak, we could show that picture and show people what's possible, right? Mm-hmm. Going from nothing to being able to be on stage and speaking at Podcast Movement a year later, that would be the dream. I still have that picture in my phone of this is going to be me next year.
Well, you've already made progress, and you've probably done more than folks who show up for a podcast conference for their first time and get excited about doing something, and then at the end of the day they never do it. But I think you realized how important this was to you, and you had the background and you had the drive to tell your story, and then I think you were inspired when you were at the talk where we met, and I think all those pieces together led to what you have now and why you have such an amazing sounding show.
Thank you. And I have to say that finding this studio space was also something that, like I said, I met people at Podcast Movement who offered that service, but I ended up finding a free studio in that. Oh, wow. I work at a university and we have a radio station. So I just, want to encourage anybody who might be listening and also kind of thinking, whether it's because you don't have good space in your home, or maybe you have a loud house with kids or animals or something that you just can't do it. There are a lot of people, I feel every day somebody else is kind of starting a new studio space. A lot of co-working spaces are putting in podcasting studios. Again, universities, if they have a radio station, sometimes they have free time that you can use. So I really do encourage people who do feel overwhelmed because they don't want to invest in the equipment, or they just, maybe it's too expensive even, that there are places. And again, you might not think of it. Again, I think university is an obvious one, but co-working spaces, business development centers. There's here in Philadelphia, they're starting putting in podcasting studios. So I have to say that, knowing that there are ways to kind of get around the technical aspects made all the difference for me. And so instead of saying, oh my God, I got to go figure out how to buy this equipment, or I've got to figure out this, I was saying, oh, let me go find people who can help me. And that was manageable. That was really manageable.
So a couple questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
About podcasting or in general?
In general.
Something I've changed my mind about. Okay, this is going to sound really ridiculous, but it's the first thing that came to my mind. I recently bought a dog. He's a Labradoodle, and I like him. I like Labradoodles the way they look because of their wonderful, like, curly hair.
Yeah.
But my Labradoodle is defective and he sheds. Like, doodles are not supposed to shed. And my husband has been saying, because he's the one that sweeps and vacuums like regularly, he's like, you've got to shave this dog. I'm like, no, he's so cute with his he's so furry and cute. And like I mentioned earlier, we're selling our house. And so I've now had to like vacuum and I'm like, oh my God, I'm shaving the dog. And I think the like bigger message here is that like sometimes like you just have to be practical, like things may look good and, you think, oh, that like it's nicer a certain way. But when it comes down to it, if you're going to spend like 3 hours vacuuming because your dog sheds and there's an easy solution, he may not be as cute. It's the same dog, right? Shave the dog.
Words of wisdom.
Yeah.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Okay, this is a good one. I'm very loud and I speak up if necessary, but I'm very much afraid of confrontation, which people assume that, if you've got to fight, throw Lori in the middle. No, I really actually like peace a lot. And I avoid confrontation, even though I'm loud. Like I'm loud and I'll, raise my hand before anybody else. But that does not mean that I am like ready for a fight. Like if you just like raise your hands, I'm like, no, don't hit me. Like that's like, I want peace. I really do want peace.
Well, I think that's what's going to happen when people meet you and when they hear your show and they get to know you. So I think what you're doing is really important. I'm so glad that you ended up in that room. I'm so glad you had the inspiration to start a podcast and that you followed up and then you had the impulse to ask me to be on the show, because that's what it takes sometimes. It takes that combination of just right place, right time, right situation. And I'm honored to have you on and I'm so excited for what you're doing. And I think we need more people who have the ability to tell stories like this, because I definitely think we need more of these types of shows and then these types of voices on the air.
Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And I can't, it's very rare that you really get to kind of thank the person who maybe inadvertently kind of pushed you on your path. And I literally it's a horrible picture. It was a selfie I tried to take of us together, but I still have that picture because I was like going to send it to you if you didn't remember me. But like really and truly, like your speech was amazing. And then you're, telling me like you just have to start it. And I think what it was is that you didn't say, no, you can't be on my show. You were like, well, yeah, you can be. You just have to have a podcast. So you left the door open, which let me walk right through it. So I appreciate how you did that, because you were like the man from, and of course, then I went and was like, oh my God, he's like really famous, and he actually said that to me. So I like believed you. Like I really believed you. And I believed you. I took you at your word that you were actually opening the door. You didn't say no.
Yeah.
So I do thank you so very much.
So where's the best place for folks to track you down online?
People can find me at myamericanmeltingpot.com. That is the name of the blog, and it's also the name of the podcast. It's all on one spot, myamericanmeltingpot.com. You can listen to the podcast right there on the website. You can also listen to it on iTunes, Stitcher, all the other great places that you can listen to podcasts. You can also find me on Twitter at Lori Tharps, and you can watch beautiful pictures appear on my Instagram feed at My American Melting Pot as well. So My American Melting Pot or at Lori Tharps, you'll find me.
And we'll have links to all those in the show notes. Thank you again for the kind words. Thank you for taking the time to show up, and hope to see your podcast movement.
Thank you. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Thanks again to Lori for coming on the show. Always appreciated when folks take the time to come on the show. Full show notes at podcastjunkies.com/192. Summaries, timestamps, any links mentioned in the show, tweetable quotes. So if you enjoyed the conversation, head on over to that page and you can tweet out about the episode. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2, which I'm staring at right now as I record this. Tune in next week for my conversation with John M. He's the host of Sober Speak, a podcast which has really fascinating conversations with folks who are in Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs. And we engaged through a conversation on Facebook. And once I started delving into his background and how he was a fan of the show, I thought it just made sense for me to tell his story and for you to hear it directly from him. So please check that one out. That's going to be next week's episode. If you made it this far, you're listening for the retention hashtag. It's going to be Melting Pot Pod. Melting Pot Pod. That's the hashtag. And you can tag myself at podcast_junkies and Lori at Lori Tharps. That's LORITHARPS. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Love you guys. Talk to you next week.